Drilling into this even further, the next thing that I want to do during this video is to demonstrate the capabilities of GTO Wizard using their AI solve and node locking functionality. If you've watched a lot of my videos before, you'll understand that I'm a huge fan of node locking. In particular, I think that node locking is where the true value of solvers come into play. Solvers, in essence, are calculators. They calculate the equilibrium of a game scenario. But in actuality, most poker hands don't operate anywhere close to equilibrium. You're going to be playing against a wide variety of opponents. Some of those opponents are going to be way too wide. Some of those opponents are going to be way too tight. Some opponents will be extremely aggressive and betting a lot of hands. Some opponents will be passive and checking and calling a lot of hands. That is not reflected in equilibrium gameplay. In equilibrium gameplay, the solver is going to take an appropriate number of hands according to game theory principles and carry those hands from street to street. And it's going to be doing so in a somewhat balanced fashion. And in actual gameplay against real life opponents, players are anything but balanced. There's always some sort of imbalance in people's gameplays. So if you are strictly studying the equilibrium outputs, it's great to have an understanding of the way equilibrium is supposed to operate at theory. But what it misses out is how you should actually respond to particular opponents if they are not necessarily playing equilibrium or where they might be imbalanced. And that's where node locking and looking at the solver outputs through a more exploitative lens can really impact your ability to use these tools to gain an edge and improve yourself as a poker player. So that's what I'm going to be doing during this particular video. Is I'm going to be looking at this Ace King 7 two-tone board, and I'm going to be demonstrating the AI solve functionality of GTO Wizard. So I have the board set up here, and this is the same formation that we've been looking at over the course of these last few videos. We are looking at this 200 big blind scenario where the hijack opens to 2.5 big blinds, the big blind 3 bets to 12 big blinds, and then the hijack calls. The flop is the ace of diamonds, the king of hearts, the 7 of hearts. So all of this is pretty standard so far, and we're starting with these. We can see on the screen, this is what the equilibrium output looks like. Now, I've alluded to this in previous videos, but there is this AI solve functionality. So what we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate the AI solve functionality first to show you GTO Wizard's capabilities to mimic what you might do in something like PioSolver or GTO Plus. So if I click on AI solve, it's going to bring up this screen, which I demonstrated in one of those earlier videos. And what this screen might look really familiar to you if you have used PioSolver or GTO Plus, because it's essentially the same type of screen that one would use to set up a custom solution. I'm not going to go through the specifics of everything of how to set up everything on this custom solution page. For those, I would recommend that you click on one of these links, the how to build flop solutions or how to set up the betting tree. I'll just click on one now to show you what this looks like. It's going to take you to the GTO Wizard help page. And within this GTO Wizard AI section, there's a lot of information here on how do you actually build custom solutions, how do you node lock, and how do you ultimately integrate this into your studies. Again, I'm not going to go through that in detail, but what I'm going to demonstrate is what you can do with this additional functionality to help you in your own studies. So let's just imagine, in this case here, we're the big blind and we're playing against the hijack. So let's just imagine that we're not playing according to GTO ranges and our opponent is not playing according to GTO ranges. So we're going to adjust our ranges a little bit and we are going to see how the output changes based on new ranges that we put into the configuration. So let's start with our opponent, who's this in position player. I'm going to click on this screen and it's going to open up this new grid for me. And with this new grid, I now can adjust my opponent's range. Now, this is the equilibrium GTO range for an opponent, a hijack opponent against a big blind 3-bet here. And right away, I can see a few things that just kind of look a little bit suspect to me. First and foremost, I expect most regular players in this case to be 4-betting with the top end of their particular range. So hands like, maybe there's some aces in there as a trap, maybe there's some kings and ace king suited as a trap, or some queens in there as a trap, but I expect actually the majority of aces through queens and ace king to be 4-betting. When you start getting into jacks and 10s and 9s, that's when I think you start getting to be mostly calls. I also expect this to be a little bit wider than what we actually see here. So hands like ace queen offsuit, ace jack offsuit, king queen offsuit, I expect this to be in a hijack flatting range at some more frequency than this. I expect hands like king 9 suited, some of these suited connectors, these low pocket pairs in there at a higher frequency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first adjust this, and I'm going to apply some blending here. So we're going to start with aces, and we're going to say that aces, I think 15% seems reasonable for aces, but then we're going to use this weighting functionality, and we're going to say that 25% of kings are in the range. And then we're going to up this to 50% of queens are in the range and 75% of jacks are in the range. Then we're going to give them 100% of all of these pocket pairs up until we get down to fives. And when we get down to fives, I'll go 75% of fives and fours, and then 50% of threes and twos in the range. And I think that's somewhat reasonable here. We're also going to say that there is about 50% of ace king suited in the range and ace king offsuit in the range. Presumably, our opponent is going to be 4-betting those at a higher clip. We're going to say that there is 75% of ace queen offsuit in the range. I think ace queen offsuit shows up much more frequently than that small amount there. We're going to say 50% of ace jack offsuit and king queen offsuit. And then finally, I'm going to give 25% of these offsuit broadways right here. And I think that's a little bit more reasonable. I'm going to go with 75% of ace queen suited in the range. And then I'll give them 100% of these rest of these suited broadways in range here. And I think that seems somewhat reasonable. We're going to give them 50% of ace 5 suited, but then I'm going to go with 75% of the rest of these suited aces. I think you end up seeing that at a higher clip. I think that you see, and I'm going to kind of blend this down for suited connectors. So I actually do think you see 100% of 10-9 suited, 100% of 9-8 suited. I will drop it down to 75% of 8-7 suited, 75% of 7-6 suited, and 6-5 suited. And 5-4 suited is when I'll go down to 50%, and 4-3 suited will be at 50%. And then the rest of these, I'm going to zero out for now, but I think they actually will probably be in there. So I'm actually going to go for the 9 suiteds, I will drop it down to 50% of these 9 suiteds, and then some of these suited connectors right here. And then we'll go 25% of the king 8 suited and 25% of 7-5 suited. And I think this is probably maybe a little bit more reasonable. I'll maybe drop down some of these low suited aces, some of the weaker ones right here. I think this might be somewhat reasonable, and a little bit, it widens our opponent a little bit more. It brings them up from about 130 combos to about 180 combos. And maybe the specific range is not as important as just demonstrating the functionality here, but I think this makes a bit of sense. Looking at our own ranges for the big blind, I think if it's important that we are reflective of the way in which we actually think we might be playing. And I know for myself, I probably am going to be 3-betting a little bit less with some of these bluffs down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust this a little bit to reflect what I think might be more likely my range as a 3-bet perspective. And I'm going to go more like 75% ace king offsuit and ace queen suited. I'm going to go more like we're going to go with 75% of, actually I'm probably going to 3-bet queens like always. I'm probably going to be 3-betting jack 75% of the time. We're going to say tens is probably 75% of the time there. Nines might be 50% of the time, and then we kind of drop off considerably from there. I will go down to 0 for the sevens and below. For the other Broadway hands, we're going to say we're going to 3-bet ace queen offsuit 50% of the time, ace jack offsuit 25% of the time. We are going to go ace jack suited 50 here. We're going to go king queen suited. So all of these are 50 for basically the rest of these suited Broadways. And then I think it's probably small amounts for the remainder of these hands. I think that seems somewhat reasonable. I am going to always throw ace 5 and ace 4 suited into this mix because I pretty much always put that in there. But I'm going to drop out these hands because I think it's going to be a little bit less reasonable that they are in my particular range. I think in most cases there, I'm probably just going to play a lot of these lower hands as flats, and I'm going to adjust that. I'll also put in 50% for king 5 suited. I think this is probably a little bit more reasonable for what my 3-betting range would look like. Again, it may be small. This may not be the as aggressive as a 3-betting range that I would you might typically want to see from an equilibrium standpoint, but I think this is probably a little bit more reasonable in terms of looking at my own ranges here. So once I get to something I'm actually comfortable with, I'm going to hit confirm, and it's going to reflect in the updated game tree here. So we have a little bit higher combos for both of our players. We also can change our stack size and our pot size, and I'm going to keep those the same. We can change the bet sizes in here. We can use automatic, in which case GTO Wizard will automatically set them for you. We can use dynamic, which you can actually choose how many bet or raise sizes you want, and GTO Wizard will determine the optimal sizings at each point, which, again, really, really, really cool. This is a great option for building out simplified, powerful strategies, which I'm going to use that actually. And then fixed, which you actually can specify exactly what you want to incorporate here. I'm going to use this dynamic. And what I'm going to do here for the big blind perspective is I want to look at 2 bet sizes, but 1 raise size. I also I don't want to always add an all-in in that case here. It's especially when we're on the flop here, all-in's just not going to be a case, and I don't want to complicate things really too much here. And, specifically, I think I'm going to keep everything else the same. We're just going to always have 2 bet sizes and 1 raise size. Again, I think this is good to keep things somewhat simplistic. So once I get something I'm comfortable with, I hit create solution, and what GTO Wizard is going to do is it's going to rerun the solve with my updated solution here. And it's already done. So you can see how crazy fast and powerful that this actually is. Now, we lose the history because we now are starting from the flop with updated ranges. Now, this is not reflecting GTO ranges. We have our updated ranges here, and now we have our big blind range against our hijack range. We can take a look at this board to see how this differs versus our prior solution. In our prior solution, we were betting small about 60% of the time, and we were betting larger 2/3 pot about, in that case, I think it was about 8% of the time. Now we're still betting in that 2/3 range. We're still betting 2/3 of our overall range, but now GTO Wizard has chosen only 1 bet size here. We're only splitting between a large 2/3 pot bet or a check. And you can see how GTO Wizard allocates the bets and checks now according to this particular range, as opposed to the range that we had previously. You can also take a look then at the updated metrics that we actually see here. And I don't remember exactly off the top of my head the metrics, but what I would recommend is that you actually write this down, right? So you look at, from an equilibrium standpoint, what your EV was, what your equity was, what your equity realization was, how things broke up in terms of, best hand, good hands, weak hands, and so on and so forth, and then how it looks now with the updated solution that you actually have. So all of the rest of the analysis is the same, but what we're now looking at is this is the updated equilibrium solution. And we can see against a check, how would our opponent fare from an equilibrium standpoint? Against a bet, what does our opponent's optimal strategy look like? So our opponent here is playing a call or fold strategy. And again, presumably now we've taken away some ace-king suited, ace-king offsuit. We've taken away some aces and kings from them. So now they don't have as much nut coverage in their range. They can't really raise as much, right? So now we can actually see the types of hands that they would be putting into this call range and the types of hands they'd be putting into this fold range. So this is a good way of actually starting with a custom solution. But we're not done yet. So this is, again, we've gone from equilibrium to a custom solution. The next step is actually node locking here. So now we have our updated ranges, and these ranges are what we think reflect reality more so than the equilibrium ranges that we saw in the previous analysis that we looked at in the previous video. But what we want to do is, as the big blind, we want to say, okay, we're playing against a particular opponent. What should our strategy look like against that particular opponent? And so what I want to do here is I want to actually node lock my opponent's strategy and guess what I think how my opponent would respond with some of the hands in his or her range. And based on that, and once I lock those particular hands, GTO Wizard will then run the solve again with those constraints in mind, giving the optimal counter strategy against that particular strategy. That is how you build strategies. That is how you build a response to what you are perceiving as how your opponent might be playing a particular hand. So that's what we're going to do here. When you're node locking, you want to click this node lock button. So the node lock button is not there when you're looking at the equilibrium solutions, but now it is. So now the node lock button is here. And when we click it, so when I open up this window, it's going to take me to this grid screen again, where I can actually start painting the strategy that I actually think my opponent would implement here. Now I can build out an overall frequency, which in this case here it's 5248, but I can change this. So let's say I wanted to change this to, we'll just call it 75. And you'll see GTO Wizard is actually changing the values here to build out a 75% call and 25% fold strategy. So maybe I don't want to be as specific in this, and I want to basically just say, I think my opponent's going to call 75% of the time and fold 25% of the time. Or maybe I might think they might raise 10% of the time. I can put a 10% raise in here too. And GTO Wizard, again, will choose the hands that best fit those particular ranges. And we can certainly do that. I actually don't want to do that. I want to set a strategy here instead. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to close out of this and reopen it. I didn't save anything, so that's why I didn't lock anything here. But I'm going to reopen this and actually click this set strategy button. And now I can actually pick individual hands and paint over individual hands. So right now it's defaulted as to the 52-48, which is the overall strategy here. But I want to actually just pick individual hands and see what I think my opponent would do. So I actually do think my opponent would have a raising range here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually change this to 100. Now it's 100 raises. And I think my opponent is going to be raising their sets, so pocket sevens, their ace-king, two pairs, and I think they'll probably also raise kings. I'm actually going to keep them as a call for aces for a trap, but I think this to me, and I'll actually also go ace-7 here for the 2 pair here. So this is what I think is a reasonable raising range that I think my opponents might raise for value. In terms of for bluffs, I think my opponent would be raising. We're going to actually just filter up here to, and actually, I want to filter this to the high equities. I think my opponent would be raising some of their flush draws, and I'm actually going to go 50-50, so 50 raise, 50 call with some of their ace X flush draws. So we will just go through these one by one. I think in terms of their Broadway flush draws, so this is where their combo flush and straight draws. So we can find Queen Jack of Hearts, Queen 10 of Hearts, and then Jack 10 of Hearts. These where I think they're going to be raising 50% of the time and calling 50% of the time. And that's what I'm going to keep as my overall raising range. Now let's get into the calls. So we're going to go to calls, and we're going to, again, just very easily switch this so you got to make sure that your percentages are in here to see what they are actually, because whatever you pick here is what's going to be reflected in what you actually select. So I don't think my opponent's ever going to be folding a king or an ace, right? So it's already not folding an ace, so we don't have to change anything there. But I think it's actually going to include king jack off, king queen off. Let's say this particular opponent I think is a little sticky and will always be calling with kings or aces. As for sevens, let's say I'm going to have my opponent who is going to be calling. I'm going to give them about 50% of the time calling with sevens. So we're going to say all of our sevens here, they're going to be calling about 50% of the time. All right, I think we are comfortable with that. So now in terms of the rest of our calling ranges. So we're going to go with some of our pocket pairs down. And I like the way it's already split up here into, some of the hearts and non-hearts. I actually find the best way of doing this is just sorting by equity and working my way down. So, down here, everything has been pure so far. I think we've already kind of split this. So now the next hands are pocket queens. I think they're always going to call with the queens of hearts, and they are always going to be folding, but I don't think they're always going to be folding with the queens without the hearts. I think it's going to be more like 50-50 with this particular opponent. Let's go to the jacks. With the jacks of hearts, I think it's going to be 75% calling, and then we're going to go 25% calling the jacks without the hearts. Let's go to the tens with the hearts. We're going to say they're going to call 50% of the time with the tens with the hearts, and they'll fold the tens without the hearts. Now we have queen jacks. I'm going to give them 50% of calling with the queen jacks here. I'll give them 50% calling with all of their Broadway gut shot boards. So we'll kind of work our way through with the queen jacks in that spot. And as we work our way down, we can essentially fill out the rest of this game tree to show what we actually think our opponent will probably do. And actually, as we start getting down to the bottom, we have essentially all of our these hands towards the bottom here are folds. So once we get to something where I think we feel reasonable with, we have our overall situations where we have some hands that are actually calling, some hands that are folding. And we're pretty customized here from an entire game tree perspective with all of our particular hands. Once we have something that we feel comfortable with, we can click this node lock button, and it will node lock our strategy. And now this game tree will re-upload, and what it's going to lock here, you're going to see the lock here in this upper right-hand part of this, right next to the hijack symbol. This is the strategy that we actually locked into place. So what I found was actually I didn't actually lock all of these ace X hands. So it took some of the hands that I had that I originally had set as calls. It automatically put them into a raising range. I'm actually not. All right, so what I did here was I re-updated things, and what I forgot to do the last time was I actually didn't lock all. So I have to lock all, and once I lock all, now I will node lock my strategy. So now I can node lock my strategy, and what GTO Wizard will do now is it will update it, and now that looks a lot better. So now it's the updated strategy as to this is the strategy that I actually node locked into place. So based on that particular strategy, the strategy that I have here for my particular opponent, now we can take a look at what our updated strategy looks like. And our updated strategy here is to just bet everything. And the reason being is that if we are betting everything, our opponent is playing a somewhat imbalanced way. They are raising most of their value hands. The other raises in range are fairly high equity. They're really, really, really good hands, ace plus flush draw type hands. And I guess I missed here a couple other hands here, but that's fine. They don't necessarily have a lot of bluffs in hands in this range to balance out the overall raising range. The calling range is also pretty wide as well too. So what we can see here is if our opponent raises, we probably are folding a lot. And we are, right? So if our opponent raises, we fold 77% of the time, and we're folding hands as good as ace queen. And we're only really continuing with our best hands here in some of those cases here, right? So we're actually even folding like ace 10 of hearts, which is bonkers to me, right? But we're against this particular player, we are folding a very, very, very strong range if they raise. If they call and we get to a turn, let's just say just a random blank turn, we can go to a turn and see what our range looks like, and it looks like now we're splitting as we normally would. So this bet on the flop is strictly geared towards this imbalanced range that our opponent has, and that's the value here of looking at this from an exploitative standpoint. And it's something that you couldn't do with GTO Wizard up until several months back when they integrated the additional functionality of Ruse AI. So I highly recommend that you play around with this and you integrate this into your study with GTO Wizard, because quite frankly, before this was included, I think GTO Wizard was a great tool to look through a bunch of pre-solved solutions. And, again, there's a lot of value in that. But I don't think it was on par with something like GTO Plus or PioSolver. But by adding this functionality in, now you can do all of the exploitative work that you could do with GTO Plus and PioSolver and Simple and all of the other solvers that are out there. Now this puts this at that level and even higher, because you start adding in the practice and analyze functionalities. This really can become your only solver that you utilize. So, again, really, really, really cool piece of functionality. I recommend that you dig into it. That's going to do it for my analysis of this particular formation. There's going to be one more video in the module. I'm going to actually have a smaller hand analysis that I'm going to dig into. It's going to be cross-posted on YouTube. So if you stick with me, we'll dig into that last video. Thanks a lot.